second hour, I thought about what I wanted to do, and I said to myself, well, I'd like to do something kind of along the lines of what we, discussed this morning, something having to do with the women. And I thought, I got a good idea. We hadn't really talked about this in a while, and it is something I think that would be good for us to think about. And that is the subject of, is it okay for women to make comments or questions in Bible class? And the reason I decided to bring that up is because that is an issue for some people in the church. That is a question that a lot of people want to know about, and being that we're talking about women and women being in subjection to men, I thought that might be a good lesson to talk about. What does the Bible say about that? Well, let's just go really to the verse in question on this subject. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 34, as we think about the question, is it okay for women to ask questions or make comments in a Bible class? 1 Corinthians 14, we're going to read verses 34 and 35. It says, "Let your women keep silent in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for a woman to speak in the church." Now, in all honesty, on the surface of it, as you read this verse, you see that the verse is saying that women are not supposed to speak in church. And obviously the kind of speaking that he's talking about here is them asking questions. He says if they want to ask a question, they're not to do it in the church. They're supposed to do it at home with their own husbands. And so you look at this and you think, well, on the surface of it, it seems like maybe this would mean a woman couldn't ask a question in Bible class. However, that may seem to be that way on the surface, and I think that's why some people, come to that conclusion. But the fact of the matter is, when we look at this verse, we have to look at it and analyze it carefully and analyze it in view of its context. Here's what I want to point out to you about this verse, and I think this really is the key to understanding this. Notice what it says here in those verses again. It says that a woman, verse 35, the end of the verse there, it says that it is a shame for women to speak in the church. Speak in the church. What does that mean? Let's define church here, okay? You say, well, aren't we the church? Aren't we as the people the church? What does that mean a woman can't speak in the church? I thought we were the church. What's it mean here? Church, the word church in this context is actually being used to refer to the assembly. You know how we say sometimes on Sunday morning, well, we're getting up and we're going to church? What we mean by church is we're going to the assembly. So the word church in the Bible is used in different senses. Sometimes it's used in the sense of talking about a local congregation. Sometimes the word church is used to talk about every Christian worldwide, the whole body of all the saved. And then in this instance here in 1 Corinthians 14, church is used in the sense of the assembly. Now, how do you know that? So, how do you know it's being used here in the sense of the assembly? Well, look in verse 23 with me. Verse 23 in this context, Paul says, "If therefore the whole church be come together into one place." It's talking about the assembly, the church being assembled. And so, in 1 Corinthians 14, verses 34 and 35, when he says that women are not supposed to speak in church, what he means is, while the worship assembly is going on, women are not supposed to be speaking out. Here's the point that I'm making to you, folks. The Bible class is not the worship assembly. It's just simply a time when we're getting together to talk about the Bible. But it is not the worship assembly. And in this context, the reason Paul is telling the women not to speak here is because whenever they would speak out during the worship assembly, as the men were up there trying to lead the congregation in worship or in learning God's Word, they were being disruptive. They were not supposed to be talking, because in their talking they were disrupting the services. If you look down in verse number 40, he says, "Let all things be done decently and in order." Them asking questions and talking during the worship assembly was causing chaos and disorder. Now, in a Bible class setting, if somebody asks a question, just asking a question or making a comment in a decent way, is that disruptive? No, it's not. Because, as a matter of fact, in reality, when somebody asks a question in Bible class, that's not disrupting the class, that's actually participating in the class. So there's a difference here in the setting and in the scenarios. This is not talking about a Bible class scenario where we open up the floor and we invite questions and comments. This is talking about the worship assembly when this is not the time for questions, comments, and things of that nature. And here's another thing I want to point out to you. A lot of people don't even know this. But if you read the full context of 1 Corinthians 14, it may shock a lot of people to find this out, but not only are the women told to be quiet, but the men are told to be quiet too. As a matter of fact, the men are actually told to be quiet twice in 1 Corinthians 14. The women are only told to be quiet once. I'm going to show you those verses here in just a second, but the question I have to ask is, does those verses mean that men can't ask questions in Bible class? And of course, you show that to people, they say, well, no, I don't think it means men can't ask questions in Bible class. This is talking about the worship assembly. Of course. That's the distinction here. This is talking about how things in the worship assembly, as the men are leading, those people who are not leading in the worship, whether they be men or women, need to be quiet and respect those who are up there leading. Let's just look at the context a little bit, because when we do, we're going to begin to see what he's actually talking about here. All right, start with me in verse number 23. He says, "If therefore the whole church be come together into one place, and all speak with tongues, and there come in those that are unlearned or unbelievers, will they not say that ye are mad?" Here's what's going on in the church at Corinth. Remember, at this time, one of the things that they had was spiritual gifts like speaking in tongues and prophesying. Well, they would actually use that in their worship service. You know, the way that we get up here and we have a lesson where somebody like me or whoever gets up and they teach you a lesson from the Bible. Well, what they would do at this time is they would use these gifts of prophecy or whatever, and they would use those as a way to give people a message from God. A miraculous way. You know, I have to study and prepare for my lessons. Well, many times, you know, if in this context of this particular time, people who had these miraculous gifts didn't have to study. God would give it to them. And as God gave it to them, God said, you speak it to the congregation. And in verse 23, what we see happening is that it was chaotic because so many people were trying to speak in tongues at once, over each other. You had a whole bunch of people getting up and all of them were wanting to speak at tongues at the same time. And Paul says here, that's chaotic. If you have people come in, what are they going to think when they see all that? They're going to think y'all are crazy. It would be like this. Imagine if we had 5 preachers who wanted to all preach a sermon, got up here on this stage and all preach their sermon at the same time. Would that make sense? What would you think about that? You'd say, that'd be crazy. Well, that's what was going on in the church at Corinth. They were so anxious to all speak in tongues or all do these, exercise these gifts that they were getting crazy with it. And Paul said, hang on, wait a minute. Y'all can't do that. Look what he goes on to tell them here. In verse number 24, he says, if all prophesy, and there come in one that believeth not, or one unlearned, he is convinced of all, and he is judged of all. Then verse 25, and thus are the secrets of his heart made manifest, and so falling down on his face he will worship God and report that God is in you of a truth. As you go and you prophesy, you need to make sure that you do it in such a way that these people coming in can understand what you're saying, and when they do, this can lead them to acknowledge God. So again, the way you prophesy and the way you handle these things matter. Drop down and notice what he says in verse 27. He says, if any man speak in an unknown tongue, let it be by 2, or at the most by 3, and that by course, and let one interpret. Here's Paul's solution to this problem. Y'all are doing it chaotically, we got to have some order about it. He says if somebody wants to come up here and speak in tongues, he said there only needs to be 2 or 3 people who speak in tongues per service. No more. And they need to do it one at a time. He says let them do it by course. You have 2 or 3 people lined up who are going to exercise their spiritual gifts, and they only need to do it one at a time. He's laying some order here. He's telling them that they need to have some structure with what they're doing. And then go on and notice what he says in verse 29 about those people, or actually verse 28. He says, and if there be no interpreter, look what it says, let him keep silence in the church, and let him speak to himself and to God. The man is told here, keep silent. If you want to get up there and speak in tongues, but there ain't nobody there to interpret it, there ain't no sense in you getting up there talking about it, you keep silent. Men are told to keep silent because if you get up there and you speak in tongues and you teach a lesson like that, nobody's going to understand you and it's pointless and it's just going to cause confusion and chaos. Men, you be quiet if you have no interpreter. So not only are the women told to be quiet, the men are told to be quiet. Then keep reading here. Look at verse number 29. Let the prophets speak 2 or 3, and let the other judge. And then he says, if any man be revealed to another that sitteth by, let him first hold his peace. Now think about it. Same thing with men who want to get up there and prophesy. Y'all need to have prophecy done. Only 2 or 3 men per service who do that, and let them do it one at a time. And he even goes on to say, if there's somebody sitting out in the audience, a man out there in the audience, and God at that moment gives him something to speak to the congregation, the man who may be up there talking, he needs to stop. Hold his peace. And let the man who's out there in the audience who God has just revealed something to, let him get up and begin to speak. Again, you can't have 2 people up there speaking at the same time. That's going to be chaos. So my point is, if you look here in 1 Corinthians 14, he's dealing not with the Bible class where the floor is open up for people to make questions and comments and participate. He's dealing with the worship assembly. And in the worship assembly, there are to be men who are leading that assembly. And as those men are leading, nobody's to be doing things that are disruptive. Nobody's to be saying things or talking over him. And here's another thing I want to point out, because this question comes up a lot as we think about 1 Corinthians 14, 34 and 35, where he talks about those women asking questions. Some people say, well, what were they asking? What were they asking questions about? Does it say? Nah, it really doesn't tell you what they were asking questions about. Now, we can have a pretty good idea of what they probably were asking about based on this context. Put yourself in the shoes of these women. You're there in this congregation and the worship assembly is chaotic. You got all these people up there speaking in tongues over each other. Wouldn't you have some questions about that? Probably. I would. So you can kind of get an idea. That's probably what they were asking about here. It's probably what they were wanting to know. And they were not supposed to be asking these questions while all this confusion was going on, because they were just adding to it. You got these men up here speaking over each other when they shouldn't be. And then the women are asking questions. It's just chaotic. So Paul comes in and says, this is not how the assembly is supposed to go. Let's have order here. If you're going to speak in tongues and prophesy, one at a time. Women, do not disrupt that. Let the men talk. Don't disrupt it. So again, this does not in any way have anything to do with Bible class scenarios. Now let me show you this. You say, well, show me a verse that actually would demonstrate to us that in a setting that's not the worship assembly, that's just simply a group of Christians getting together and talking about the Bible, that a woman could talk and make comments. Go to Acts 18. Really simple example I'll give you. Acts chapter 18. Acts chapter 18. Now in Acts 18, what's going on here is that Apollos is going around and he's teaching people something that's not true. Now he's not doing it out of defiance. He's doing it ignorantly. He's doing it in sincerity, but Aquila and Priscilla see him doing that. And so they pull him to the side and have a Bible discussion with him. Look what it says here, Acts chapter 18. Look in verse number 26. It says, "And he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, whom when Aquila and Priscilla, a husband and wife, man and woman, heard, they took him unto them and expounded unto him the way of God more perfectly." Not only was the husband here doing the talking, but even the woman was doing the talking. Well, does this mean well, hang on a minute. A woman ain't supposed to be talking in a Bible discussion. Well, she was here. 1 Corinthians 14:34 does not have anything to do with a Bible discussion. It has to do with the worship assembly. And what we see here from verses like Acts 18, verse 26, is that in a Bible discussion, there's nothing wrong with a woman participating in that, making comments or things like that, because that does not disrupt anything. That is participation in that study. So hopefully this helps with that question and that concern, and hopefully this helps us to understand that a little bit better. But as always, we want to extend the invitation for one who may be here who's not a Christian. The opportunity is yours to obey the gospel. And if you're here, you are a Christian, and in some way you've been straying away from God, we also give you the chance to repent and to come back. If we can help you with anything, then please let it be known as together we stand and sing.